Chosen one, stop. Not because something is wrong, but because something is finally right and you almost scrolled past it. You're not broken. You're not behind. You're not being punished by silence. What you've been carrying isn't proof that love passed you over. It's proof that your frequency is being refined to a level most signals can't reach. The soul approaching your life isn't looking for someone perfect. They're looking for someone clear. Not a miracle, not a promise with an expiration date, a truth you've already felt but haven't had language for yet. Stay with me. Here's the thing. There's a moment, and you've probably had it more than once, where you're sitting in a quiet room and everything around you looks fine. The job's stable, you're functioning, you're even showing up for other people. But inside, there's this low hum of something unresolved. Not panic, not grief exactly, just this persistent awareness that something meant for you hasn't arrived yet. And the longer it doesn't arrive, the more you start to wonder if the waiting itself is the answer. Let that land, because that question is the silence telling me something is the most important question in this entire conversation. And the answer is yes. It is telling you something, just not what you've been afraid it's saying. The silence isn't a verdict, it's a frequency check. And those two things couldn't be more different if you tried. Most people interpret prolonged solitude as rejection. They build a case against themselves. They run through the list what they did wrong, what they gave too fast, who they trusted too soon. And with each pass through that list, the story gets sharper and crueler. I must not be the kind of person who gets this. That's not discernment. That's a wound doing its own math. And wounded math always gets the wrong answer. Here's what nobody tells you. Solitude isn't the absence of connection. It's the architecture of it. Every season where you've been alone and unmatched wasn't the navigator abandoning your coordinates. It was him recalibrating them. Slowly, deliberately, with a precision that doesn't explain itself while it's working, because the work requires your stillness, not your understanding. Think about that. Two vessels crossing the same ocean don't find each other by accident. They find each other because they're transmitting on the same frequency. And if one vessel's signal is distorted by unresolved pain, by borrowed patterns, by years of shrinking to fit spaces not built for it, the transmission goes out wrong. It finds the wrong signal back. Not because it deserves the wrong signal, because that's how frequency works. It doesn't judge, it just responds. So what you've been experiencing isn't chaos. It's a calibration process. A slow, sometimes agonizing tuning of the instrument you are. Every closed door was the tidekeeper, refusing to let you anchor somewhere you'd eventually have to leave anyway. Every relationship that ended, even the ones that broke something in you, was the signal being corrected before it locked in the wrong destination permanently. That's not cruelty. That's protection, wearing a mask you didn't recognize. Take a breath right now. Not a rushed one, the kind that tells your nervous system, I'm still here. Because this isn't spiritual comfort food I'm offering you. This is mechanics. When Ecclesiastes says there is a season for everything, it isn't saying wait passively and eventually something nice will happen. It's saying every state you're in is functional. The fallow season in farming isn't a failure season. It's the season the soil is being prepared to hold something that couldn't survive in exhausted, overworked ground. You've been fallow. You haven't been forgotten. And there's a difference between those two things that'll change everything about how you carry yourself from this moment forward. Now watch this. The shift I want you to make right now isn't about hope. It's about orientation. Stop asking, when is this going to change? Start asking, what is this season building in me that the next one will require? That pivot from passive endurance to active preparation is the difference between someone who survived the waiting and someone who was shaped by it. The soul approaching your life isn't coming for someone who made it through. They're coming for someone the season actually transformed. Here's the thing about the navigator. He doesn't send signals into noise. He waits until the channel is clear. And right now, chosen one, something in your channel is becoming clearer than it's ever been. Not because the pain is gone, because you're finally holding it differently. You're here, you're listening, you're asking the right questions. That's not nothing. That's the beginning of everything. And the first thing we need to dismantle starting right now is the story the world handed you about why you're still waiting. Because that story has been costing you far more than you know. The world handed you a story early, so early you don't even remember receiving it. It came through the movies you watched, the conversations around the dinner table, the way adults talked about people who were still single past a certain age, with that particular tone that sits somewhere between pity and suspicion. The story went like this: if you are good enough, interesting enough, healed enough, lovable enough, connection will find you. And if it hasn't found you yet, the variable that needs adjusting is you. That's the equation. That's what you were taught. And here's why it's been quietly destroying you. Here's the thing. That equation sounds reasonable on the surface. It even sounds motivating. Work on yourself. Become better. Show up differently. And there's truth buried in it. Self-awareness matters. Growth matters. But watch what happens when you apply that equation to prolonged solitude. Every year that passes without the connection you've been preparing for becomes evidence of your inadequacy. Every person who leaves becomes data confirming the original verdict. You don't just feel lonely, you feel behind. And being behind feels like failure. And failure over time feels like identity. That's the trap, not the loneliness itself, the meaning you've been conditioned to assign to it. The old version of you absorbed that meaning without questioning it, because when you're inside pain, you don't audit the story explaining the pain. You just carry it. You get better at carrying it. You smile in the right places. You give wise advice to other people about patience and timing. And quietly underneath all of that, you're running the same exhausting calculation. What is still wrong with me? Stay with me. Because this is where the deconstruction has to be surgical. The world's narrative about loneliness is built on a fundamental misunderstanding of how connection actually works. It treats love like a marketplace. You build your value, you list your qualities, you show up at the right venues, and eventually a transaction occurs. That framework turns human beings into products and relationships into exchanges. And when the exchange doesn't happen on schedule, you conclude the product is defective. But that's not how frequency works. And it was never how the navigator designed this. Here's what nobody tells you. The reason you haven't found the right connection isn't because you've been doing the wrong things. In many cases, it's because you've been doing the right things in a distorted signal. You've been giving real love, real attention, real loyalty. But you've been transmitting from a frequency that was still shaped by what you needed to heal, not by who you were becoming. And those are two completely different broadcasts. The first one pulls in people who match your wounds. The second one draws in people who match your wholeness. You can't get the second result while you're still running the first signal. Think about that. Because this isn't abstract theology. This is something you've already experienced in the body. You've been in a room with someone and felt your chest tighten for no reason you could name. You've met someone who said all the right things and still felt something in you go quiet and cautious. That's your frequency, doing real-time assessment, not your fear, not your damage, not your overthinking. Your actual signal, when it's clear enough already, knows the difference between chemistry and resonance. The problem isn't that you can't feel the difference. The problem is, you've been taught to override it. Now watch this. The lie about loneliness isn't just you're not enough. The deeper lie is, you should be able to figure this out faster. That lie creates urgency. And urgency is the enemy of discernment. When you're in a hurry to not be alone, you don't wait for recognition, you settle for familiarity. And familiarity, when it's built on shared wounds rather than shared wholeness, feels like home. It feels safe. It feels like finally. But it's just the same signal, finding the same frequency it already knows. The cycle doesn't break because you tried harder. It breaks because the signal changes. Let that land. The navigator isn't withholding connection from you as punishment for something you did or didn't do. He's refusing to let a distorted signal lock in a permanent destination. Isaiah 43:19 says, "Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it?" The new thing isn't a new person appearing. The new thing is a new frequency emerging in you. One that doesn't broadcast from lack. One that doesn't transmit desperation dressed up as openness. One that's finally clear enough to be recognized by the soul that's been calibrating on the other side of the same ocean. That frequency, chosen one, is already forming in you. And what we need to do next is understand exactly what has been jamming it, because the interference isn't coming from the outside. It never was. So if the lie about loneliness is external, handed to you by a world that doesn't understand frequency, then the interference I mentioned at the end of the last chapter is something more personal, more interior. It's not the world's noise that's been jamming your signal. It's a current running underneath everything you do in relationships, one you didn't choose, one you didn't create, but one you've been swimming in so long, you stopped noticing it as a current at all. You just thought that's what water felt like. Here's the thing, there's a pattern that shows up in people who are genuinely good at loving, and you are one of those people that's not flattery, that's diagnosis. You show up fully, you remember the details. You stay when things get hard. You give the kind of attention most people only dream of receiving. And yet somehow the people who've received all of that haven't been the ones who deserved it. You've loved people into their best versions and watched them walk into that version with someone else. You've held space for people who couldn't hold space back. You've been the stable ground that someone else stood on while they found their footing, and then they left when they found it. And if you've never said this out loud, let me say it for you. That is an exhausting and quietly devastating way to love. But here's the question that actually matters. Not why do people leave that question keeps you focused on them. The question is, what frequency was I broadcasting that kept selecting for people who needed to be carried? Because here's what nobody tells you about being a natural giver, a natural stabilizer, a natural safe space for other people. When that capacity comes from a healed place, it's one of the most powerful forces in any relationship. But when it comes from an unhealed place, from a wound that learned love means being useful, being needed, being the one who stays, it broadcasts a very specific signal. And that signal is extraordinarily good at attracting people who need exactly what the wound learned to provide. Stay with me. This isn't about blame, not theirs, and especially not yours. This is about understanding the mechanics of what's been happening so you can stop being surprised by it. A radio tower broadcasting on a particular frequency doesn't attract the wrong stations because it's broken. It attracts exactly what it's tuned to. The question has never been, why do I keep meeting people like this? The real question is what in me recognizes them as familiar, and why does familiar feel like home? Think about that. Familiar doesn't mean right. Familiar means your nervous system has been here before. It knows the terrain. It knows how to navigate the specific geography of this particular kind of person, the one who needs saving, or the one who's emotionally unavailable, or the one who's brilliant and broken and just needs someone patient enough to wait for them to choose you. Your system doesn't flag these people as dangerous. It flags them as known, and known feels like safety. But it's not safety, it's just recognition of a pattern your wound already understands how to survive. Now watch this. The difference between a trauma bond and a resonance connection isn't always obvious from the outside, and it's almost never obvious at the beginning. Both feel intense, both feel significant, both can feel like finally, but they work in completely opposite directions. A trauma bond contracts you over time. You get smaller inside it. You self-edit more, need more reassurance, feel less certain of your own perceptions. You start asking, am I too much or am I not enough? Sometimes both in the same week. A resonance connection does the opposite. You expand, you think more clearly, you feel more like yourself, not less. Your nervous system doesn't brace, it rests. And that distinction, Chosen One, is the most important diagnostic tool you have. Here's the thing about the tidekeeper. He doesn't change the current by removing the ocean. He changes it by shifting what's underneath the surface. The deep currents that determine where a vessel ends up aren't the visible ones. They're the ones running below the waterline. And the work of this season, the real work, the unglamorous interior work, is learning to feel what's running below your own waterline. What belief is operating underneath the choices you make? What does the wound still believe love requires of you? Because until that current changes, you can change everything on the surface. The dating apps, the boundaries, script, the therapy language, and still find yourself in the same water. Proverbs 4:23 says, "Guard your heart above all else, for from it flow the springs of life." Not guard it by closing it, guard it by knowing it, by understanding what it's been broadcasting and why. Because the soul approaching your life isn't coming to fix your current. They're coming to meet you in the one you've built, the clear one, the honest one, the one that finally knows the difference between familiarity and resonance. And building that current starts with one specific interior practice we haven't talked about yet. That interior practice isn't meditation though, stillness helps. It isn't journaling though, clarity on paper has its place. It isn't another round of identifying your attachment style and naming it correctly. You've probably already done that work and found that naming it didn't automatically change it. The practice I'm talking about is simpler and harder than any of those things. It's learning to read your own signal in real time, not in retrospect, not in therapy sessions 3 days after something happened, but in the actual moment when the current is moving, when someone is standing in front of you, when the choices live and the old pattern is pulling. Here's the thing. Calibration isn't a one-time event. It's not a breakthrough you have and then you're done. It's a discipline. The same way a compass doesn't point north once and retire. It's constantly adjusting, constantly orienting, constantly responding to the field it's moving through. And the reason most people never develop this skill is because they've been taught to evaluate relationships from the outside in. Does this person check the boxes? Do they have the qualities on the list? Are they consistent? Are they available? Those are valid questions, but they're downstream questions. They come after the more important upstream question, which is, how does my own signal behave in this person's presence? Stay with me, because this is where the work gets specific. There are 3 internal states that tell you more about a connection's actual nature than anything the other person says or does. The first is your baseline anxiety level, not the healthy alertness of something new, but the chronic low-grade monitoring that shows up when part of you knows something isn't right, but the rest of you isn't ready to admit it yet. You know this feeling. It's the one where you're checking their social media, not out of curiosity, but out of a need to manage uncertainty. It's the one where a delayed response throws your entire afternoon. That's not love making you attentive. That's your signal telling you it doesn't feel safe. And instead of reading that as information, you've been reading it as evidence that you care too much. Now watch this. The second internal state is your self-expression pattern. Think about the last person you were genuinely interested in. Were you more yourself around them over time, or were you becoming a curated version of yourself? Were you editing before you spoke? Were you softening opinions you actually held? Were you performing a kind of emotional availability you thought they needed rather than showing the actual texture of who you are? Because here's what nobody tells you. The early stages of a resonance connection don't require performance. They feel remarkably ordinary in the best sense. You don't feel like you're auditioning. You feel like you're just present. And presence, real presence, is something your nervous system recognizes immediately, even if your mind takes longer to catch up. The third state is what happens when there's friction, not crisis friction, small friction, a misunderstanding, a moment where you wanted something different than what happened. In a connection built on wound frequency, friction triggers the whole system, the over-explaining, the withdrawal, the need to resolve it immediately before you can breathe again. But in a calibrated connection, friction is just information. You can sit with it. You can name it without catastrophizing it. You can say, that didn't feel right to me, without needing the entire relationship to be re-evaluated in the same breath. That capacity to stay regulated inside disagreement is one of the clearest signals that both people are operating from a calibrated frequency, not a desperate one. Let that land. Now here's the reality injection, because this needs to leave the abstract and enter your actual week. You're in a team meeting. A colleague takes credit for something you contributed to clearly in front of people who know it was yours. The old pattern says, stay quiet, feel the resentment, replay it for 3 days, and eventually decide you're just not good at advocating for yourself. The calibrated response says something different. It says, I can name what happened clearly and without hostility, because my sense of value doesn't depend on this room's confirmation. That moment, that specific moment in the conference room, is practicing the exact same internal muscle you'll need when someone you're interested in says something that doesn't sit right with you. The muscle is the same. The context changes, but you only develop it by using it before the stakes feel romantic. Here's the thing about the navigator. He doesn't grant you discernment as a gift wrapped in a moment. He builds it in you through the ordinary encounters you've been dismissing as irrelevant to your love life. The co-worker who oversteps. The friend who only calls when they need something. The family member who redefines boundaries every time you establish one. These aren't distractions from your preparation. They are your preparation. How you hold your signal in those spaces is exactly how you'll hold it when someone worth holding it for is finally standing in front of you. Chosen one. Calibration isn't the waiting room before connection. It is the connection with yourself first, before anyone else gets the frequency. There's something that happens after enough disappointment. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It just quietly becomes the new architecture of how you move through the world. You stop leaning forward. You start watching instead of participating. You become extraordinarily good at reading rooms, reading people, reading exit routes, because part of you decided somewhere along the way that the cost of being wrong about someone again was simply too high to keep paying. And so you built something. Brick by brick, experience by experience, a structure that kept the chaos out. And for a season, that structure saved you. Here's the thing. The wall worked. That's the part nobody wants to acknowledge, because if we admit the wall worked, we have to also admit why we're still standing behind it. The wall kept out the people who would have drained you further. It bought you time to heal without interference. It gave your nervous system a rest from the constant threat assessment that comes with being emotionally open in spaces that weren't safe. You didn't build it from weakness. You built it from intelligence, from pattern recognition, from a self-preservation instinct that was doing exactly what it was designed to do. But here's what nobody tells you. A wall is static. It doesn't discern, it just blocks. And once the threat that required it has passed, the wall doesn't update itself. It keeps blocking everything with the same indiscriminate efficiency it used when it was necessary. The person who would have exploited your openness gets blocked. The person who would have honored it gets blocked too. The wall doesn't check credentials, it just holds. And the longer it holds after the danger has passed, the more it stops being protection and starts being a different kind of prison, one you built yourself with your own hands from your own pain. Stay with me, because I want to make a distinction that's going to change how you think about being guarded. There is a profound difference between being protected and being closed. A protected person has discernment. They can open selectively. They can read intent. They can let the right things through while holding the wrong things at the boundary. A closed person has armor, and armor doesn't discriminate. Protected feels like a lighthouse. Closed feels like a bunker. The lighthouse is visible. It sends a signal. It draws the right vessels toward it, while the rocks beneath it make clear to the wrong ones that this is dangerous territory. The bunker is invisible. Nothing gets in and nothing gets out. Think about that. The navigator didn't design you to be a bunker. He designed you to be a beacon. And the difference isn't about being naive or reckless with your heart. It's about understanding that your visibility is itself a form of protection. When you're fully present, fully honest, fully yourself, the people who can't handle that tend to self-select out early. The mask wearers don't stay long around someone who isn't performing. The energy vampires don't find much to feed on in someone who isn't running on anxiety. Your clarity, when you allow it, does its own filtering. You don't have to build walls to keep the wrong people out. You just have to be genuinely, unapologetically yourself. That alone will do the work. Now watch this. Here's the reality injection. Someone new enters your life. They're consistent. They follow through on what they say. They're not overwhelming. They're steady. And instead of receiving that steadiness as information, you find yourself looking for the flaw, waiting for the reveal, telling yourself that nobody this consistent exists without an agenda. So you test them. You pull back to see if they'll chase. You create small crises to see how they respond. You delay vulnerability indefinitely because opening the gate feels identical to the last time you opened it when it didn't end well. Here's the hard truth: in that moment you're not being discerning. You're punishing someone who hasn't committed the crime yet for a sentence that belongs to someone else. Let that land. The wall doesn't know the difference between the person who broke you and the person being broken by your silence. It just holds. And holding indefinitely past the point of necessity isn't wisdom. It's a different kind of wound operating under the name of self-protection. The question to ask yourself isn't, is this person safe? You can't know that with certainty, and requiring certainty before opening is just the wall with better vocabulary. The question is, am I responding to who this person actually is, or to who I'm afraid they might become? That question. Chosen one is where the wall begins to become a beacon. Not all at once, not recklessly, but honestly. So you've started asking the right question. You've begun to feel the difference between the wall and the beacon, between reacting to a ghost and responding to a person actually standing in front of you. And now something important becomes possible that wasn't possible before. Not because the right person has arrived yet, but because your signal is finally clear enough to do something your signal couldn't do when it was running on wound frequency. It can recognize. And recognition. Chosen one is an entirely different experience than anything you've been taught to call falling in love. Here's the thing. The world's entire romantic framework is built on the language of discovery. You find someone, you search for them, you look for the one. The metaphor is always archaeological, as if the right person is buried somewhere, and your job is to excavate them from the terrain of your life. And that framework makes love feel like a treasure hunt, which sounds romantic until you realize it also means you're always one wrong turn away from concluding you've been digging in the wrong place. The discovery model creates perpetual seeking, and perpetual seeking keeps you in a state of incompleteness, always oriented toward what hasn't arrived yet, never fully inhabiting what's already here. Recognition works differently. It's not something you go out and find. It's something you suddenly notice was already forming in the quality of a silence, in the way a conversation doesn't require effort, in the strange absence of the internal monitoring system that usually runs at low volume whenever you're around someone new. Recognition doesn't feel like fireworks. That's the part the movies got catastrophically wrong. It feels like your nervous system exhaling. It feels like the background noise you didn't know you were living with suddenly going quiet. It feels more than anything else like you don't have to translate yourself. Stay with me, because this is subtle and it matters enormously. When you're in discovery mode, you're always building a case. You're accumulating evidence that this person is right, their qualities, their consistency, their compatibility with your values and your vision. And evidence building is exhausting because evidence can always be countered. One inconsistency and the whole case wobbles. One moment of disappointment and you're back at the beginning, re-evaluating everything. But recognition doesn't require a case. It's not a conclusion you argue yourself into. It's a knowing that arrives before the argument even begins. Now watch this. Here are 3 specific real-world signals that tell you recognition is happening, not chemistry, not attraction, not the particular thrill of being chosen by someone impressive. The first is that you stop monitoring the conversation for safety. You're not calculating your responses 3 beats ahead. You're not editing for palatability. You say what you actually think, and then this is the critical part, you don't immediately regret it. The words came out, and they were yours, and that felt fine. That ease, that unguarded quality of speech, is your signal telling you the frequency is clear. The second signal is that their presence in a hard moment doesn't make the moment harder. Think about a time when someone being around you during stress made the stress worse because you had to manage their reaction to your stress on top of managing the stress itself. That's a frequency mismatch in real time. Now think about the opposite, someone's presence that somehow makes the weight distributable, not because they fix anything, not because they have the right words, just because they're there, and their being there doesn't cost you anything. That's not a small thing, that's an enormous thing. And it's one of the clearest marks of resonance you'll ever encounter. The third signal is how they handle your boundaries, not the dramatic ones, not the moment you have to end something or refuse something significant. The small ones. You say you're tired and you need to stop the conversation. You say you're not comfortable with something minor. You disagree with something they said. Watch what happens in the next 30 seconds. Do they receive that information and adjust without drama, without withdrawal, without subtle punishment? Or does something shift in the atmosphere, something that makes you feel like you'll pay a small tax for having had a preference? Here's the thing, the way someone receives a small boundary tells you everything about how they'll receive a large one. Don't wait for the large one to find out. Let that land. Because here's what nobody tells you about recognition. It also requires you to be recognizable. And being recognizable means being present enough, clear enough, and honest enough that who you actually are is visible. Not your best behavior version, not your first date performance. The actual texture of you, your opinions, your rhythms, your particular brand of strange, your non-negotiables, and your soft places. The soul approaching your life isn't looking for a flawless presentation. They're looking for a clear signal. And a clear signal, chosen one, is simply a person who has stopped pretending to be a frequency they're not. The deep responds to truth, not perfection, not readiness in the way you've been defining readiness as having everything figured out before you allow yourself to be seen. But the readiness of someone who knows who they are clearly enough that the right signal can find them. That's the work of this entire season distilled into a single sentence. And now that the signal is clearing, we need to talk about what you actually do with it, because recognition without stewardship is just a beautiful moment that doesn't hold. Recognition without stewardship is a door that opens and closes in the same moment. You see it clearly, the right signal, the right quality of presence, the right kind of ease. And then, because nothing inside you has been prepared to hold it, you either self-sabotage it quietly or you grip it so tightly it distorts under the pressure. This is the part of the conversation most people skip, not because it's too hard, but because it sounds unglamorous. Stewardship isn't romantic. It doesn't have a soundtrack. But it is the single difference between a connection that transforms your life and one that simply visits it. Here's the thing. The navigator doesn't withhold good things from people who are ready. He withholds them from structures that can't hold them, yet not as punishment, but as precision. Think about what happens when significant rainfall hits ground that's been compacted by drought. The water doesn't absorb. It runs off, not because the water isn't good, not because the ground doesn't need it, but because the ground hasn't been prepared to receive at the rate the rain is falling. You can want the rain desperately, genuinely with your whole being and still watch it run past you because the interior structure wasn't built to hold it. That's not a spiritual crisis. That's a stewardship problem. And stewardship is something you can actually work on right now. Stay with me. There are 3 specific domains where stewardship matters before connection arrives, and each one of them has a practical this week application that has nothing to do with dating or searching or waiting. The first is stewardship of your attention. Where your attention goes is where your energy flows, and where your energy flows is the frequency you're constantly reinforcing. Right now, today, take an honest inventory. How much of your daily attention is being directed toward connections that are actively draining you out of guilt, out of history, out of the fear that releasing them means being alone? Every hour you spend managing a relationship that has no future is an hour you're not spending building the interior capacity that the right relationship will require. Now watch this. This isn't abstract. If a portfolio manager kept pouring capital into consistently underperforming assets because they'd already invested so much, we wouldn't call that loyalty. We'd call it a failure of stewardship. The same principle applies to your emotional economy. Loyalty to something that's costing you more than it's building you isn't virtue, it's habit dressed up in the language of commitment. The navigator doesn't honor the sunk cost, he honors the current allocation. The second domain is stewardship of your standards. And here's what nobody tells you about standards. They're not a list you write once and defend forever. They're a living document. They need to be built from wholeness, not from wound. Standards built from wounds tend to be either too low because the wound believes it doesn't deserve more, or performatively high because the wound is using standards as a wall we discussed 2 chapters ago. Standards built from wholeness are different. They're specific, they're honest, and they're held without apology, but also without aggression. They don't need to be announced. They just need to be lived. Think about that in a concrete situation. Someone asks you to compromise something that actually matters to you, not something trivial, but something load-bearing in how you function. Your standards aren't what you say in response, they're what you do. Do you hold the line clearly and without over-explaining, or do you negotiate yourself out of your own boundary because the discomfort of their reaction feels harder to manage than the cost of the compromise? That moment, that specific, ordinary, unglamorous moment, is a stewardship moment. And how you handle it is training your system in exactly the kind of holding capacity you'll need when the connection that counts is finally in the room. The third domain is stewardship of your peace. Let that land. Peace isn't the reward you receive after everything resolves. It's the asset you protect while things are still in motion. Chosen one. Your peace is not a passive state, it's an active practice, and it's the most important thing you bring into any relationship you'll ever have. A person who has learned to maintain their peace under pressure, under uncertainty, under the particular strain of not yet that person, doesn't enter a connection desperately. They enter it with weight, with stability, with the kind of groundedness that a resonant soul can actually build something on. Here's the thing about the tidekeeper. He doesn't send the tide to an unguarded shore. He sends it to the one that's been shaped to receive it. The shore doesn't brace, it doesn't reach, it simply holds its form, and the tide finds it precisely because of that. Your form, right now, the clarity you're building, the standards, you're learning to hold the peace, you're choosing to protect, that is the signal. That is what draws the frequency toward you, not the searching, the holding. So, you've been building the interior structure. You're learning to hold your signal clearly, to steward your attention, your standards, your peace. And now, something needs to be said that most conversations in this space are too afraid to say, because it risks making the destination sound less magical than the journey toward it. But magic built on fantasy doesn't hold. And what the navigator is building in you is designed to hold. So let's talk honestly about what the connection you've been preparing for actually looks like when it arrives. Not the version the world sold you, the real version. Here's the thing. The soul approaching your life is not coming to complete you. That phrase, my other half, my missing piece, the one who makes me whole, is one of the most romantically appealing and structurally dangerous ideas ever handed to human beings. Because if someone else completes you, then you are by definition incomplete without them. And incompleteness is a frequency. It broadcasts. And what it broadcasts for is someone who needs to be needed, someone who will feel significant precisely because you feel insufficient. That's not resonance. That's two wounds agreeing to call each other the answer. Stay with me. The soul coming toward you is a whole person. Refined, tested, shaped by their own season of calibration. The details different from yours, but the process identical in its purpose. They didn't arrive fully formed either. They had their own closed doors, their own pattern of wrong currents, their own wall that had to become a beacon. They've done interior work you'll never fully see, and they carry scars you'll need to honor without requiring them to perform their healing for your reassurance. They're not arriving to rescue you. They're not arriving to be rescued. They're arriving to walk beside you, and that distinction. Chosen one changes the entire architecture of what you're building together. Now watch this. Here's what that actually looks like on a Tuesday. Not a significant Tuesday, just an ordinary one. One of you has had a genuinely hard day, not a crisis, just the accumulated weight of something not working, something frustrating, something that's taken more than it gave. And the other person doesn't immediately try to fix it, doesn't minimize it, doesn't redirect to their own hard week as a comparison. They just stay. They ask one real question, and then they listen to the actual answer, not the polished version. That moment, that unremarkable, unfilmed, unposted moment is what divine partnership looks like in its most essential form, not the grand gesture, the quality of ordinary presence. Here's what nobody tells you about resonance connections. They're not always emotionally intense. In fact, one of the most disorienting things about encountering the right frequency after years of high-drama connections is how quiet it feels at first. Not boring, quiet. There's no constant need to manage the dynamic, no low-grade monitoring of their mood, no performance required to maintain their interest. And for people who've been conditioned to equate intensity with depth, that quiet feels suspicious. It feels too easy. It feels like something must be wrong because nothing is requiring you to fight for it yet. Think about that. If you've spent years in connections where love felt like labor, where you earned it through consistency, through patience, through being the one who stayed, then a connection that doesn't require that labor will feel unfamiliar. And unfamiliar, as we established in Chapter 3, can feel like absence, even when it's actually presence. The calibrated response isn't to manufacture drama to make it feel real. It's to let the quietness be what it is, not emptiness, but room. Space for two whole people to exist without constantly managing the distance between them. Let that land. Now, the concrete situations. When one of you receives an opportunity, the other doesn't. A promotion, a project, a season of visibility. The resonance connection doesn't contract around it. It expands. There's no scorekeeping, no quiet resentment dressed as support. The one who isn't in the spotlight right now genuinely amplifies the one who is, because they understand their turn isn't cancelled by someone else's moment. When finances get tight, and they will at some point because life includes pressure, a resonance connection doesn't produce blame, it produces collaboration. Two people looking at the same problem from the same side of the table, not pointing at each other, pointing at the situation. And when there's genuine disagreement, not a test, not a power play, but an actual difference in perspective on something that matters, the resonance connection has one consistent quality. Neither person has to disappear to survive it. You can be fully present in the disagreement, hold your actual position, and still feel the connection underneath the friction. Ecclesiastes 4:9 says, "Two are better than one, because when one falls, the other lifts." But notice that verse assumes both people were standing in the first place. The navigator isn't sending you someone to catch your constant falling. He's sending you someone to walk beside your standing. That's the partnership worth building yourself toward. And building toward it, Chosen One starts with understanding what it can actually produce when both frequencies are operating at full capacity. Two whole people, same direction. Neither running the wound frequency, neither broadcasting from lack, neither requiring the other to be the answer to a question that was never theirs to answer. When that alignment happens, and it will happen because you've been doing the work that makes it possible, something shifts that goes far beyond the personal, far beyond what either of you would have produced alone. This isn't poetic language. This is a principle woven into the structure of how the deep designed influence to work. Here's the thing. Alignment isn't addition. When two calibrated frequencies come into agreement, same values, same direction, same quality of interior stability, the result isn't 1 + 1 = 2. It's multiplicative. The authority you carry individually gets weight added to it that neither of you generated alone. Rooms feel it before you speak. Decisions carry more gravity. The people around you sense something operating underneath the surface of your interaction, a coherence, a settledness, a lack of the low-grade competition that poisons most partnerships. That's not charisma, that's architecture. And the navigator builds it deliberately, which is exactly why he doesn't rush it. Stay with me. Let's make this concrete. You walk into a negotiation, a business conversation, a significant professional moment, and your partner, your aligned frequency, is with you. Not because they're performing a role, because they're genuinely present. You don't need to coordinate your messaging in the elevator on the way up. You already know where each other stands because you've built the kind of communication that happens before the room. The other people in that meeting feel the coherence between you. They don't know what to call it, but they adjust. They take you more seriously, not because you tried harder, because you arrived more unified. That's authority produced by alignment, and you can't manufacture it. You can only build it through the interior work that precedes it. Now watch this. Financially, the principle is identical. Money doesn't flow into chaos, it flows into structure. And two people operating from the same values, the same vision, the same standard of stewardship create a financial structure that a single person simply cannot replicate alone. This isn't about combining incomes, it's about combining frameworks. When both people look at resources the same way, not identically, but fundamentally aligned on what matters and why opportunities find that structure. Doors open, not because luck arrived, but because the container was finally coherent enough to hold what was being offered. Philippians 4:19 says, God will supply every need according to his riches, but supply flows to capacity. And capacity is something two aligned people build together in ways that would have taken either of them twice as long alone. Think about that. A single unexpected financial pressure, a large bill, a market shift, a season of reduced income. Two people with misaligned values around money will find that pressure becoming a wound in the relationship. It'll produce blame or withdrawal or the particular silence that means something is being held back. Two people with aligned stewardship will find that same pressure becoming a problem they solve together without it costing them the connection. That resilience isn't luck either. It's the product of having built the interior structure before the pressure arrived. Let that land. Because here's what nobody tells you about generational weight. It isn't about legacy in the distant future. It's about what you model right now to the people watching you right now. The colleagues who notice how you handle a difficult situation without losing your groundedness. The younger people in your orbit who are watching to see if what you say about faith and integrity actually shows up in how you move. The friends who are one more disappointment away from concluding that the kind of connection you're building toward doesn't actually exist. Your alignment, chosen one, becomes proof of concept for everyone who needs to see it. Not because you perform it, because you live it. The tidekeeper doesn't invest in vessels that are still taking on water. He invests in the ones that have done the work of becoming seaworthy. And seaworthy at this stage means exactly what the last 9 chapters have been building toward: clear signal, honest frequency stewardship that holds under pressure and the capacity to receive what's coming without either gripping it too tightly or letting it run through unprepared hands. You're almost there. The last thing that needs to be said is the most important, and it isn't a promise. It's a charge. You came into this conversation asking in one form or another the same question you've been carrying for longer than you'd like to admit. Not always in words, sometimes just as a weight. Sometimes as that 3 a.m. awareness that something meant for you is still in motion somewhere out of sight. And what I want you to understand as we close this is that the question itself has changed. Not because I changed it, but because 10 chapters of honest work tends to do that. You're not leaving here with the same question you arrived with. And that shift, quiet as it is not a small thing. Here's the thing. The tide doesn't announce itself before it turns. There's no dramatic moment where the ocean pauses and declares a new direction. It just changes. Gradually, then undeniably. And the only people who miss it are the ones who stopped watching because they decided the water wasn't moving. You haven't stopped watching. You're still here, still paying attention, still willing to do the interior work that most people abandon the moment it stops feeling like inspiration and starts feeling like discipline. That willingness, chosen one, is itself a frequency. And it's been transmitting the entire time. Stay with me for these last few things. 3 to carry, not as rules, as orientation. First, stop explaining your season to people who don't have the context to understand it. Not everyone deserves access to what the navigator is building in you. Some things grow stronger in silence. Some covenants are weakened by premature announcement. The most significant things in your life right now don't need an audience, they need your protection. Guard what's forming. Let the fruit reveal it when it's ready. You don't owe anyone a live broadcast of your becoming. Second, the soul approaching your life will not arrive because you searched hard enough. They'll arrive because you became clear enough to be found. There's a version of waiting that's passive. You're just enduring time, hoping something changes. And there's a version that's active. You're becoming, deepening, building the interior architecture that the right frequency can recognize from a distance. Everything in this conversation has been about the second version. You've been doing the second version. And clarity, real clarity, doesn't go unnoticed by the deep. It never has. Now watch this. Third, and this is the one that matters most. The connection coming toward you is not the destination, it's the context. There's a version of this story where you receive everything we've talked about, the resonance, the alignment, the partnership that expands rather than contracts, and you treat it as the finish line, as the place where the work ends and the reward begins. That version doesn't hold, because a connection between two whole people isn't a conclusion. It's a beginning of a different kind of work, more expansive, more generative, carrying more weight than either of you carried alone. The navigator didn't prepare you this carefully just so you could arrive and stop. He prepared you so you could finally begin at full capacity. Let that land. Because everything you've been through, the closed doors, the wrong currents, the seasons of calibration that felt like abandonment, the walls that had to become beacons, none of it was wasted. Not one chapter of it. The tidekeeper doesn't waste tides. He uses every one of them to shape the shore into something capable of holding what's coming. And what's coming. Anointed One is not just a person. It's a purpose that requires 2 aligned frequencies to carry it. It's an influence that neither of you could generate alone. It's a demonstration lived out in the ordinary texture of a shared life, that wholeness attracts wholeness, and that the deep still authors stories worth telling. The tide has already turned. You may not feel the full force of it yet, but something in you knows it. That's why you stayed. That's why this landed the way it did. The signal is clear, the shore is ready, the frequency is transmitting at a level it has never transmitted before, and somewhere on the other side of the same ocean, another vessel just felt it. If something in this conversation named what you've been carrying without language, leave your mark here. Not for me. For the person behind you who's still in the middle of the waiting, still asking the old question, still one honest word away from understanding what their season has actually been building. Your presence in this space is itself a signal. Let it reach who it was meant to reach.